Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. And today we have reached the last episode in our Fixing Democracy series. That is, the last episode before next time, when David Klemperer and I will try and answer some of the many questions, suggestions, comments, ideas we've had about how to fix democracy. But today I'm talking to the historian Ayse Zarakol, not so much about fixing democracy as about what democracy is currently up against. We're talking about strongmen and the age of strongman politics that we're living in. Where do these strongmen come from? Just how unusual is this kind of politics in the broad sweep of history? And crucially, does democracy have what it takes to deal with them? Ayse, I want to start by asking you about the words that we use to describe the thing that we're going to be talking about. And I think of it as the thing. It's the thing that has been happening to liberal democracy and to other regimes that are adjacent to liberal democracy over the past generation, maybe particularly in the last 15 to 20 years, maybe accelerating in the last 10 years, even 5 years. Sometimes it's called the turn to authoritarianism. That's one of the words that's used. Sometimes it's called autocracy, an increasingly autocratic character to these regimes. Sometimes it's called strongman politics. There are other possibilities too. I don't think we want to go down the fascist rabbit hole, but we can if you would like to. Of those, I've never known in my own mind which one works best as a single term, because they each seem to have problems with them, actually. But which one are you most comfortable with in trying to describe the thing? I think we know what we mean by the thing, but what is the word we should use for it?
Given that those are our options, I think I like strongman the best, because I think it gets at something about the trend that we're in, which is about the privatization of the state, personalization of politics. And I don't think autocracy, fascism, any of these words really get us there, because not all autocracies are personalized dictatorships. They're not. Many autocracies are ideological. There's some kind of party or like a larger cause. Even in fascism, there is the worship of the state, but the state is not necessarily about the person of an individual. So strongman, it's not an ideal term, because I think it makes the problem seem sillier maybe than it is. But I think it does get at that individualized nature of this type of autocratic politics. And I don't think it's only democracies that have been challenged by this, because I think we're seeing strongmen emerge even in monarchies, and which is kind of an odd thing to say. But if you compare, for instance, Saudi Arabia before MBS to Saudi Arabia after MBS, that was a system, even though it was a monarchy, that had certain kind of traditional checks and balances ruling through consensus of the ruling family. And MBS eliminated all of those checks and balances, got rid of those traditional norms. So I would say he's kind of a strongman within that setting. He's further privatized even that monarchic setting. So we're seeing that everywhere. China after Xi, an autocracy that has produced a strongman. Yeah, it's a global trend.
And I want to ask you about the ways in which it is partly because these leaders are imitating each other. But on the autocracy, authoritarian, strongman range of possibilities as a descriptive term, another way to think about this is that, to my mind, autocracy tries to highlight the ways in which power is concentrated. So it's about autocracy, technically means power being concentrated in an individual leader or the people around the leader. It could be in a court or a clique of people, but it's about power being narrowed down. And so for a regime to take an autocratic term, it might be a regime where power is meant to be more plural, more dispersed across institutions, more competition in the system. Authoritarianism, to me, suggests the way that power is conveyed or projected. It is about how citizens are expected to conform to the regime. So the authoritarian is the person who is stifling protest and is requiring certain things of citizens, certain kinds of conformity, whatever it might be. And then in my mind, I'd always thought of strongman. Your definition just now is a bit different, and it seems to me deeper than this. But I'd thought of it as a style, a kind of style of politics, a personalized style, maybe a privatized style, but also it is about, some of it at least, is about the performing of the strongman role. And let's talk about lots of different people. We can talk about Erdogan and Orban and others, but I don't want this all to be about Trump. But if I think about Trump and the Trump regime, particularly Trump 2.0, it feels like it has these three things going on. There is an autocratic element to it in the sense that power is being concentrated in a system where it is institutionally designed to be more plural. There is an authoritarian element to it because it is about the projection of power, the insistence on conformity, not just in the party, but in the wider public. And it is definitely strongman. It is a style. And I can't decide which of those is the most significant. But also, it does feel to me possibly like the strongman thing captures the other two. So this is a long way of asking that question, which is the strongman thing, at least conceivably, the other two are too specific. It's not just authoritarian conformity. It's not just autocratic concentrations of power. There's something about the combination of two that produces a style. Is that fair?
I guess so. I think strongman, it's like the logical conclusion of the first two steps. So some of these trends within the American setting, of course, they predate Trump. We were talking about, unitary executive presidency during George W. Bush, the war on terror. And even before that, there was this general 20th century trend, more power going from the states, federal system to Washington, D.C. So, already there is centralization of power and authority, the weakening of, Congress compared to the president. So some of those trends are in place. Then, if it's used in an authoritarian way, as you described it, that's maybe a next step. But I think what the strongman adds, what Trump adds, is this privatized element. It's about, there's kind of in all of these settings where strongmen emerge, there's kind of an identification of the state with the person of the ruler or the president or, whatever that person is called in that system. So it becomes about Trump. Trump is the same thing as the US. I mean, this hasn't yet happened in the US in its full form. But, for instance, in the Turkish context, Erdogan's survival, or in the Russian context, Putin's survival is the same thing as Russia's survival or Turkey's survival. State resources are controlled by, at least in theory, one person. And it's whatever state services you're lucky to get, it's benefaction by this person. It's not like something that you're entitled to as a citizen, as a taxpayer, but through the largesse of this person, you're getting various benefits. So it's kind of a flipping, I think, of the modern systems that we've created back to a very old kind of understanding of politics. And I do think it's something different from just 20th century style autocracies. I mean, in the Turkish context, which is what I'm most familiar with, you can compare, for instance, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, the founder of the Turkish Republic, with Erdogan. Again, Atatürk was kind of a strongman type figure. He was an autocrat, you could say. He was a war hero. But there was an ideology, a larger ideology within which his actions were legitimized. And he himself did not want to create a dynasty or, he talked about Turkish modernization, independence, all of that. And that ideology later became Kemalism and was perpetuated through the military. So that's a flavor of autocracy, and later maybe a tutelary democracy, a democracy that's under the control of a military. That's something I think different from what Erdogan is doing, where it's just about Erdogan, his family, his entourage, his household. And that, reminds me of the early modern empires, the Mongols, Genghis Khan's family, or something from maybe antiquity, like these figures that we know from antiquity who thought themselves as immortal, as gods, something before, politics before the modern state. That's the trend I think we're seeing. I mean, we're not there yet, but it's the erosion of modern institutions. And we're defaulting to some more basic mode of politics, perhaps.
And as you said, there's an irony here because the example you gave of Saudi Arabia and MBS, it's a monarchy that has gone strongman. And yet the thing that you're describing, I think, to a lot of people is a description of a version of monarchical politics before the institutional structures of the state were created to, I mean, I think the word for it is to either impersonalize or depersonalize personal rule, personal authority. And it went through a transition phase in the absolutist period, the early modern period. So the most famous statement of a political leader identifying himself with the state is Louis XIV saying, "I am the state," or "the state is me." That's modern in the sense this we're in the modern era, but it's definitely an attempt to assert monarchical rule as a form of personal identification with the state. And what has meant to have happened since is a trend away from that towards impersonal, depersonalized rule structured around institutions, norms, constitutions, the rule of law, the ability of courts and judges to intervene, all of that, political parties, bureaucracies that are neutral and will serve different regimes, all of that. And it does sound a bit like what you're describing is an erosion of all of that back to something which is really basic, which is power is located not just in an individual, but in the personal relationships it is possible for that individual to have. So it is personalized because it is the politics of personal relationships, which is pre-modern kings, courts, emperors, Genghis Khan.
Yeah, it's about the court, it's about the household. Foreign policy it's reduced to who that person gets along with at that time, who they feel friendly to, gift giving. Yes, so a reversion to some of those older norms and expectations. I think it is, as you say, an erosion of the modern institutions. So both domestic institutions, but also international institutions. So, I mean, that depersonalization of the state in the West in many settings, but even outside of the West, even in non-democracies, that we had traveled a long way towards depersonalization of the state. A place like Saudi Arabia maybe had traveled less of less of that path. So it was a shorter reversion for them in a monarchical setting. But there were international norms and institutions that, created this expectation that, everybody was supposed to be a kind of a nation state with citizenry that had rights. The international institutions and norms are also eroding. I mean, the more strongmen emerge in the West, and it's the Western democracies that were kind of the standard bearers for the modern state, the more they revert back, the less likely any of these international checks will hold. I don't think they will hold, actually.
So if you look at the kinds of people who are associated with this trend in the contemporary world, Putin, Erdogan, Orban, maybe Modi, Trump, people who are currently out of office and indeed centers of all sorts of contests around the rule of law like Bolsonaro in Brazil, and then people who are sort of, I think, associated with the fringes of this. Nigel Farage might be one. Maybe not even with the fringes of it. And I want to talk to you in a minute about women who are strong men, but Le Pen in France. When you look across that spectrum, Putin at one end, I don't know who is at the other end, actually, as I describe it, maybe Maloney at the other end? I don't know. Do you think that the family resemblance is stronger than the differences? Because it would be possible to pick it apart a bit and say, look, Putin is a very different kind of leader. The way he's exercised power over a long period is very different from, say, Maloney in Italy coming to power with people panicking that Italy's about to elect a fascist. But I don't think anyone thinks that now, not much anyway, though some of the things that she's done have borne out the fears of the people who thought that was going to happen. But she has located herself within the institutions in a way that political leaders who are not strong men, Keir Starmer, for instance, is not a strongman politician, but he looks to Maloney for some clues as to how he could govern more effectively. So if you've got Putin at one end and Maloney at the other, is there still enough of a family resemblance across this piece that we can say the trend to strongman politics is the dominant trend of contemporary politics? Or should we say more about the differences?
I think depends on your perspective. if I was a historian or, a biographer, of course I would focus on the differences of the biographies of these leaders. But given that my background is in social sciences, I am more likely to focus on the similarities, the bigger pattern, the macro patterns. I do think it's the structural conditions that are producing the strongman. So the individual profiles are not so important, I think. It's in every setting the structural condition is kind of selecting, almost in a evolutionary way, the person who can fill that role. And that depends on when it's happening and also, the particular cultural and political norms of the country. So in Russia, you have Putin, who's different character than Trump, but he is the right character for the Russian setting to be a strongman, and Trump is the right character for the US to be a strongman. The question of Meloni is interesting. I think, if there are similarities between their psychological profiles, it's an ability, a willingness to break the rules in that given setting, a kind of ruthlessness, not being kind of constrained by, like, not having internalized the rules of that society or the political culture of that society. I think that's a commonality, or whatever it was before they came to power. I don't know if, Meloni is really fitting that description. Italian politics was already producing many characters like Meloni, so you could say she's more of a continuation of the norm, and also there's that gender element. So I do agree she's a populist politician. I'm not so sure she's a strongman in the way that I understand it. Remains to be seen. But, of course, she is kind of a fellow traveler. You could participate in these types of politics being a strongman yourself. You could kind of, part of the coalition.
Was Berlusconi closer to the model? Because when I think back, people often say that Berlusconi is a neglected figure as a sort of sign of what was to come. With Berlusconi, it was deeply personalized. He presided over a political, industrial media empire, which was very dominated by his personality and his personal identity. He treated politics like an extension of his businesses, which is possibly another feature of this. He was a businessman first, but a very personalized businessman, and business itself might, as a model, because it is so dependent often at the top level on interpersonal relationships and certain amount of rule breaking and norm ignoring. And Berlusconi, who I think people now think of as a joke, wasn't a joke. And he also was, maybe more than Meloni, the prototype.
I think so. For the Italian context, I think he's closer. And of course, we had figures like this in other settings, in Central Asia, in Sub-Saharan Africa, and so on. So people who want to be strongmen have been around. It's not like they are something new, but they were in the 20th century. They were generally constrained, maybe until the 1990s. Even those in what's called the developing world or the global south had to pretend to be ideological in some ways. Like Gaddafi had to pretend to be ideological. And I think that general norm has broken down. Now you can't say, like Louis XIV, I am the state. So that's, I think, what's different about the 21st century, that's become, strongmen everywhere, and they're not hiding. They're not ashamed. They see themselves as like the wave of the future.
On that question of the gendered aspect of this, the style is clearly male. I think it's fair to say. They're not called strongmen just by chance, but say Marine Le Pen, she seems to conform in many ways to the type. She is herself the product of a dynastic politics, and it is dynastic. And then, as with all dynasties, there are the fallouts and the interfamily feuds and so on. That's part of the cycle of this. She seems to be, like many of these leaders, someone who is very aware of modeling herself on the broader style. So there seems like a conscious mimicry going on. How much difference does it make when the strongman is a woman? How much difference did it make historically when the strongman is a woman? Queen Elizabeth I, she didn't think she was a queen. She thought she was a king. That's the word she used for herself, or a prince. The idea that she would choose to describe the role in a way that focused on being a woman first. So maybe this is pre-modern in that sense too. We're back in the ages where strongman is like a word like prince. It just means the person who fills that role.
Right now, just because I'm a bit skeptical that Meloni, ticks all the criteria. There isn't an obvious female leader who you could easily say is a strongman. But I don't think there's any reason. I think women are less likely. I mean, first of all, they're less likely to be politicians. They're less likely to be in positions of power. And once they're in that position of power, I think they are probably less likely to act like strongmen, because strongman, it's all about, me, me, me. And just because of gendered socialization, we know that women are less likely to be acting that way, I suppose. But there is no reason, with all those caveats, there's no reason why you couldn't have a female strongman. I think it's quite possible.
Again, I need to be careful about this because I don't know enough about it, but there is that tradition of, I think, the female strongman in Sri Lankan politics. There is also, Indira Gandhi is a very interesting figure in the history of Indian politics. It was dynastic. It involved the turn to autocracy and authoritarianism in the 1970s under Indira Gandhi. She was the one who suspended the rule of law and the constitution. And yet, say, talking about someone from the 70s, I agree with you. That's the pre-strongman era in a way. That's the authoritarian autocratic era. It's not. Indira Gandhi has got nothing in common with Donald Trump, for instance, I would say.
Yeah. So usually it's like serving a cause, or it's like, again, like Le Pen, you said she's part of dynastic politics, but it's like she's serving the family name in a way, like Benazir Bhutto is serving the family name. So how much of it can they make it just about themselves, like that they are? It requires a certain degree of self-centeredness, I think, especially if you're like the first mover in a setting. But, it remains to be seen. I think it's possible. We just don't have a clear-cut example yet. Definitely of female autocrats, female leaders with authoritarian tendencies, female leaders who rule with an iron fist. You have examples of this. But somebody who makes the state all about themselves, it's possible, but not yet in the 21st century.
You said that the underlying causes for this, when you take the macro view, are broadly structural. This isn't just an accident of history. At the same time, I suggested that some of this is imitative, in the sense that I think the acceleration of this is partly because if you are that style of leader, you have many more leaders in that style to observe. Which of those two things do you think is dominant? Would it be fair to say that the structural explanation can account for the broader trend, say over the last generation, but in the last 5 to 10 years, the acceleration feels a little more like it is almost a network effect, that these leaders are joining a club when there are more members, it's easier to join that club?
I think both are true. So on the one hand, I think strongmen proliferate at the end of things, so we're at the end of the 20th century order. Perhaps we're at the end of like the modern era, what could be called, from, if you take it from 18th century to the 20th century. But definitely we're at the end of the 20th century order, which has been unraveling arguably since the late 70s, one could say.
How would you characterize that order? So the 20th century order that has been unraveling, calling it the 20th century order can be confusing because it doesn't map the 20th century. So what are the characteristics of that order that are unraveling, separate from the fact that the strongmen are helping to unravel it? What is the underlying set of conditions at work here?
I mean, in international relations, many people like to call it, the liberal international order or something like that, where liberal democracy and liberal international organizations were what you aspire to. But in my mind, I think of it as, well, okay, the nation state is still there. But other than that, I think 20th century is characterized by the idea of the people, equal citizenship rights, and accountable state institutions. I mean, it doesn't have to be democracy, but there's this idea, a particular configuration of state-society relations, and the state kind of speaking for the people. And, you have the democratic version of that. We had the Soviet model, which seemed to promise another path towards modernization. So that came apart earlier. And I think that now the Western or the liberal version is also falling apart. And we don't know what to replace it with. And when you don't know what to replace it with, the strongman become kind of the default answer. And as part of, the reason why I said the 20th century order, but also I think, the modern solution to what we might call the strongman problem is also, I think, breaking down. Again, this idea that the state is supposed to be accountable to people because we, as human beings, we have rights. Everybody has rights. That idea is kind of being eroded or being hijacked, being captured. Again, we don't know what to replace that idea with. So those are, I think, the structural conditions that allow for strongmen to emerge. But then what you say is also true. A trend first starts slowly and then it gains speed. So the earlier strongmen, those that came to power, well, first of all, the ones that tried their hand at this, as I say, in the 20th century were very constrained. They had to pretend to be ideological. They had to fit into certain international expectations and norms. But those that emerge in the 1990s, early 2000s, it was slow going for them. Even for Putin, it was slow going. It took him a while to consolidate his power. Erdogan, it took him like 2 decades, what it has taken Trump literally months to do, because even though Turkey was not, in many ways, not democratic as the United States, there were all these checks and balances, the military being one of them. So dismantling all of that took a long time. Yeah, so the earlier ones had a tougher time. Now that they're everywhere, the expectations have flipped. So the international norms, instead of encouraging, democratization or depersonalization of the state, this is how a modern state functions. Instead of those, we have, well, if the world's hegemon, if you could put China into this as well, there is also a personalization of the state in China around Xi. Not as much maybe as some other settings. The Communist Party is still functioning, but there is still a centralization, personalization, privatization going there. So the world's 3 most powerful countries, put Russia in there, they are now governed by strongmen, arguably, these personalized regimes. So if you're a smaller country, it's becoming almost irrational to have a different type of regime. Like, why would you not want to have a kind of a charismatic leader yourself who could hang out with, Trump in the White House? So then, that becomes the norm, the expectation. So it becomes easier for strongmen to emerge in other settings that are maybe spared some of the structural pressures.
I want to ask you about Trump because you said just then he has managed to do in a few months what it took Erdogan, Putin 2 decades to do. But the few months we're talking about is Trump 2.0, second time around. So what's so interesting about Trump is from 2016 to 2020, 2021, when he was finally removed, he was playing the part of a strongman, for sure, but it didn't really have much purchase. It had some, but the institutions were relatively resistant. The attempt to personalize relationships, the attempt to co-opt the military and other institutions of the United States, the attempt to really ride roughshod over separation of powers and so on. He tried it. He succeeded in some respects, but it felt like, broadly speaking, that style of politics in the American setting had been relatively constrained. And second time around, it feels completely different. The extent to which the barriers in the way of this style of politics have just fallen apart. Not all of them, but significant numbers of them. And the style, the way of doing politics, that strongman version of politics that you've described, is so much more visible. It's like it's broken through some shell that contained it last time. It may have been a very fragile shell. Maybe the lesson we should draw from it is actually the illusion was Trump 1.0, the illusion that the constraints had worked because it only took a certain amount more heft and they just fell away. But what do you think explains the difference between the two? Is it just the second one is further along this story that you're describing, which is a global trend? Trump 2.0 just comes in the story at a later stage than Trump 1.0. Those 4 or 5 years make a difference? Or is it that the institutions, the norms, the constraints were weakened? He loosened the jar first time round, and this time he's just taken the lid off. Do you have an explanation for the difference?
I think it's all of those things, but also I think the people he had around him, it was, he wasn't, I don't think, expecting to win. And then the revolving door of the first Trump presidency, many of the people involved in the administration were, people who still worked within the norms of the American government and were afraid to go to certain places. I mean, there were exceptions like who've continued, like Stephen Miller and so on. But I think the intervening 4 years, he was able to put together a team or the right kind of people flock to his side, like people who are going into this with their eyes open. I mean, they are trying to create this new in the American setting, this new regime. So I think people who think like the midterms or anything, it's going to reverse this trend, I think they are still deluding themselves a bit in the same way that a lot of people deluded themselves during the Biden years, a lot of people in Europe, but also in the US, that this was kind of an aberration and things would go back to normal. I mean, I don't think there's a normal to go back to. And also, I think the fact that as far as Trump is concerned, they tried to take him out, but couldn't, that has emboldened him. A similar thing happened in Turkey. There was a constitutional case against Erdogan in his actually second term when his party was in power. The old system brought a case in the constitutional court. They tried to dissolve the party for unconstitutional activities, eroding the principle of secularism, that sort of stuff. And it was a split decision in the constitutional court, and the party stayed open. But Erdogan took that as, they came after me when I was playing by the rules, so I have nothing to lose. So that kind of, I think, untethered him from the last remaining attachment he had to the old system. And from then on, it's just, it's all about Erdogan. Before that, he was arguably playing more by the rules. I think something similar happened with Trump. As far as he's concerned, they came after him when he was trying to play by the rules. So what does he have to lose? And it's working out for him. So,
and those people who have spent the period between his first presidency and his second deciding not to be fooled again, I think we're meant to believe that they have looked much more closely than first time around at international models of this. So Hungary is the one that is often held up. There was a lot of interplay between Orban and some of the people around Trump second time around. But other places too, I believe, have been used as models, probably not explicitly someone like Putin. But it does feel more like the second time around that they are serious about learning from the example of this being done in other places.
Yeah, I mean, actually, it's not that complicated, I think. So they are learning. I mean, in the sense, what the biggest lesson that they are learning is that you can do this and get away with it. That's the lesson that they're learning. If you believe that, then all you have to do is whatever checks and balances there are in your system. Again, in every system, it's something slightly different. In the US, it's the fabled, three parts, the judiciary, the legislative, the three branches, but already, so much had fallen into place. You have the Supreme Court's decision saying the president can act with complete immunity. The Congress had already ceded so much of its power to the presidency even before Trump. And then what remains is the federal system. But, once you control the courts, then whatever pockets of resistance. Yeah, so then you declare maybe states of emergency. There are all sorts of things in the playbook, all sorts of pretexts you can use to grab more power. But I think what you see really from other settings is so much of what we call, again, my background is in political science. So if you do a PhD in political science in the US, you're taught about constitutional design. These are the rules of, proper countries. And I was always skeptical, these are things that are written, but why do they work? And Americans had such a belief that, that they work because they are perfectly crafted rules. But rules only work as long as people obey them, and there's a mechanism of enforcement. And, there's no perfect mechanism of enforcement. So much of it is actually people having internalized certain behaviors and never thinking that things could be different otherwise. the success of strongmen in settings around the world show, you can break the rules. There's nothing to stop you. Who's going to stop you? You can get away with it. And that's all you need to know. And then, all bets are off.
Do you think in the American case there was a kind of complacency coming out of that mindset that you describe, which is might happen in other places, but we have got a system which first is tried and tested. It has survived very serious challenges in the past. There have been many periods in the history of the American Republic where it's looked like it might have been captured by a more autocratic or authoritarian or even strongman form of politics, and it has resisted that. It maybe took a civil war and other things. But there were tests that were survived and survivable. And secondly, like you say, we wrote it down. So it's not like anyone should be in any doubt about this. So they might have a playbook, but we've got a playbook. It's called the Constitution. And actually, that creates a complacency because it forgets that none of this means anything without people willingly conforming to the norms. Writing it down doesn't help if people are going to break the rules.
Exactly. Yeah, I think United States, part of the reason Trump is able to move so fast is, yes, there were all these, earlier stages, this drift of power towards the center, all of that. But part of the reason is because I think it's very hard for Americans to accept the fact that this could happen in the United States. Despite, as you say, like there being many not great episodes in American history, they're not necessarily taught that. The general messages of American exceptionalism, America having escaped the forces of history, other bad stuff happening somewhere else, not in the United States. So even now, I think there are lots of people. Of course, there's, again, people are worried. Some people are worried, but a lot of people, I think that things will right themselves because they always do for the United States. That's kind of the idea that the Constitution or somebody will protect the United States. And I think, when I compare it, again, I've talked about Turkey, it's been a long story, but people have been, really fighting, fighting for trying to protect ballot boxes, doing all they can because they knew like Turkish democracy was so vulnerable and fragile. They didn't have this belief that things will fix themselves or right themselves. And I think in the United States, there's greater complacency. People have too much faith in the system. That's a worry. That's why he's able to go so fast.
It reminds me of a phrase that gets used a lot. It's really come into vogue, I think, in the last 5 years in the United States, which is people bemoaning that the guardrails are down, the loss of the guardrails. Where are the guardrails? We want the guardrails back. And my problem with it is it's a very passive image. It's a very passive image of politics. So it brings to my mind a bowling alley where the guardrails are the things you put up on the side if a child is trying to get the ball down the other end or someone who's never bowled before. And the ball will bounce off the guardrails and then it will get to the end. It will knock over the pins and you'll feel like, I can bowl. And then the idea is you learn to do without guardrails. You learn how to bowl. And it's sort of like, I've forgotten how to bowl. I want the guardrails back. It's a very passive thing. What you should do is remember how to bowl. You need to remember how to play the game, not to say, the reason this isn't working is the thing that protected us in this passive way. We bounced off them and it sort of forced us back onto the lane so we would get down to the other end. They're down. We want them back up again. Whereas the other person is just, under current conditions, knows how to get the ball down to the other end of the bowling alley. I've made this a rather elaborate image, but it's like, if he can get it down to the other end of the bowling alley, the guardrails aren't going to save you. You need to learn how to get it down to the other end of the alley. And it has become the default for many people. The New York Times, I don't know how many times the phrase guardrails has appeared in the last 5 years, but it's not doing any good because the guardrails aren't going to save you. You've got to save yourselves.
Yeah, it's about the people. What everybody needs to realize is democracy is not anybody's birthright. It's not like something that you automatically have because you were born in a Western society or if you're of a certain race or something. It's actually the most complicated, most difficult kind of political system. So it has to be constantly maintained and protected and all that. It just takes a lot of work. A lot of things have to go right. You could do everything right and still it might not work. So it really needs our protection, our everyday vigilance. And that's, I think, what maybe another thing that we've lost. We've come to take things for granted.
I want to ask you about the UK. You've lived here for a while. You lived in the United States. You know Turkey intimately. The UK is now your home. And the UK system is one in which we've not had a strongman leader unless you count Boris Johnson. So let me start with that question. Does Boris Johnson fit the type?
No, I don't think so.
No, I don't think he does either, but I just want to. He was sometimes described when he prorogued Parliament to try and provoke an election to get Brexit done. There were uses of that term to describe him. There were opinion surveys where people were asked, wouldn't you rather have a strongman style of politics to get things done rather than democracy? And there was a lot of shock at the number of people, particularly young people, who said, yes, we would like that. And that was thought to be about Boris Johnson. But to me, what you have described doesn't really describe him.
No, I don't think so. I mean, you could imagine him being in power and, there being kind of an international norm and, kind of. I mean, I'm not saying it's beyond him. Like, if the conditions were right, but I don't think when he was prime minister, he was a strong man. I think he was constrained by a lot of things, including public opinion. I mean, which is part of the reason, he resigned. So, yeah, I don't think he was a strong man.
But Nigel Farage does more closely conform to the type, not least the imitative version of this politics. He's very close to Trump. He has connections with Orban, and he fits the mold in some ways. Also, his recent rise, the speed of it, feels to me like of a piece with this. The fact that I would say it's in the last 6 months, and maybe even in the last 6 weeks, that people in Britain have to take seriously the possibility that he could be the next prime minister. It would have seemed impossible a year ago, I would say. And now people are having to take it seriously. And the speed of that feels like it's only possible under a set of conditions where expectations and norms are breaking down quite rapidly. But on the other hand, the British system isn't the American system, and American politics is more personalised in some ways than British politics. Yet the Prime Minister's office has a lot of power. Power is centralised in the British system more conventionally than it is in the American system. So this is a long way of asking you, how vulnerable do you think British politics is to this trend? And say were Farage to become Prime Minister, should we think, right, we are now in that club of nations that have this kind of politics in power?
I mean, we've already talked about the international environment. It used to be a constraint on strongmen, very much so in the 20th century. Now it's almost an incentive given the direction of travel with the US especially. So that would kind of indicate that if Farage was in power, he would likely at least try to appear a fellow traveler. I think the domestic system that we have in the UK is a constraint because it's historically there's very little tradition of, I think if you have tradition of strongmen, not that, you're culturally predisposed to it, but it's the more centralization there's been historically, the easier for new centralizers. And I mean, we've talked about Elizabeth before, but actually I think maybe Cromwell, but, I don't think monarchy even, fits the description, even in the age of absolutism. I mean, there were always, with exceptional periods, generally there's a degree of power sharing, in contrast to the US, maybe you don't have written rules, but a very strong norm of different, I mean, even like the class system is a kind of constraint, one could say. So it would be difficult, I think, because the political and cultural norms of the country are against this type of model. It would be difficult to institute it. But then there is the larger macro structural push. So those two would clash. It doesn't mean it can't happen here, but I don't think it's necessarily very fertile ground compared to some other settings. But I think if if the UK, if Britain falls, then it's like we will know this is a global trend that's not stoppable, and which may be true, unfortunately.
So thinking of the things that could stop it, because this can't just be an inevitable trend. There's not strongman determinism at work here. This is all contingent. Politics is a contingent business. And even when there are structural forces at work, there are always multiple paths that could be taken. One of the things that you described there, which I had always thought, particularly in the American case, was the big constraint on this politics, was not the political system, not the Supreme Court that could be co-opted in the way we see it has been co-opted, and not just something broadly called civil society in the sense of people organizing maybe on the streets, but just the strength of the non-political institutions. So civil society in the sense of a society made up of all sorts of alternative sites of power. So business is one. In the United States, Silicon Valley would be one. Universities would be another. I often think universities are a very good test of this. In the Turkish case, universities have been very vulnerable to the regime. Harvard University, even in Britain, actually, Oxford and Cambridge universities are very powerful institutions, self-confident, robust, with deep histories. And in the United States, we are seeing these are the battlegrounds now in many ways. Trump and Silicon Valley is one of these battlegrounds. Trump and Harvard is another of these battlegrounds. The federal system, so that's more political, Trump and California, but California not just as a state, but also as a kind of state of mind, a way of being in the world. Trump and Hollywood. Now, I thought that these institutions would be harder to co-opt. And actually, I've been quite shocked, given how incredibly powerful they are. Harvard, Silicon Valley, Hollywood. Okay, Hollywood's in trouble, but still, let's call it Hollywood. I don't know, the oil business, whatever it is. These titans have, to my mind, been more vulnerable than I thought to this politics in a society like the United States, where to rise to the top in these other sites of power is to have real power. And I've been shocked. I don't know how it's going to play out. And actually, I'm not convinced Trump's going to win all these fights. I think he's going to lose some of them. But it feels to me like that is the number one safeguard, a society in which there are people who are seriously powerful in ways that are much harder for the political center of power to simply capture. And Britain may be like that too. I'm not sure. That will be the test, right? Farage comes to power. I think the test will be, does the BBC stand up to him? That would be a good example in the British case.
Well, doesn't look like it.
Okay, so tell me why we should be pessimistic about that. I have to say, I'm more pessimistic than I was. I think I was complacent about the United States. I wrote an article in, I think, 2017 or 18, which was just headlined, "The United States is not Hungary." I'm not sure anymore.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think any country is safe, So the universities, I mean, all these strongmen go after universities. I mean, it's almost one of the first things that they do, like Modi in India, Orban, Erdogan. They've all done it. Now Trump is doing it. And why do they do this? I mean, yes, partly they don't like the politics of the universities. But I think the real reason they go after universities is what you say. These are alternative centers of power. They are alternative authorities of credentialing and expertise. And as long as they exist as autonomous, independent units, the state's authority is somewhat limited by their existence, the privatized state. So they want to bring them into the fold. I mean, either destroy them or make them completely subservient to the center, just as Henry VIII went after churches. So that's kind of the centralization model. You don't want independent institutions of authority and credentialing. So universities are even more powerful in some ways. I mean, even though they're less powerful in certain ways in terms of wealth and so on, they're more powerful than maybe even the Silicon Valley in that way, because they decide, who's an expert, who gets to work in what field, in a way, through diplomas and so on. So do they stand up? One would hope so. I mean, one would hope that the universities in the US and the centers of business look to other settings, just as the people around Trump have, and learn from Hungary and Turkey and other places that the earlier you resist, the better your odds of survival. But they don't seem to be learning that lesson, because what happens is when you are confronted, I mean, it's kind of a collective action problem, and you kind of pick your short-term survival over actually long-term survival of maybe the whole sector or the industry. I mean, the way Erdogan brought all the newspapers, because they had newspapers and TV channels had owners. I mean, they were not all like state channels. It wasn't just the equivalent of, ITV and all of that. He brought huge tax bills. I mean, he used like the tax mechanism. And because these owners of these TV channels and so on, they had other businesses. They were just, they were like kind of Jeff Bezos, right? Like owning Washington Post. And, they made deals. They started making editorial decisions. And then suddenly, like 15 years in, we had seemingly many TV channels and newspapers, but they were all coming out with, the government line. with the headline. So that's relatively easy to do. And I think we're seeing that certainly in the American context with the law firms, with Silicon Valley. I'm sure you've seen the recent meeting he had with all the leaders of the tech companies where they're all like praising him and thanking him and all of that. Yeah, so these are short term survival strategies. Maybe they satisfy shareholders and so on, but long term, it just increases the power of the center, which is now under the control of one person.
And how much of this is about, so this is a word we haven't used yet, but how much of this is about corruption, in the sense that if you have to say, what are the reasons why over time we move from personal to impersonal, depersonalized forms of politics and therefore of control, it was partly because everyone understands that personal power is corrupt and corrupting, never mind corruptible, but it is corrupting. And if you want to strip that out, you have to have these impersonal institutions. And the loss of those institutions just brings corruption back in. Again, the speed of it, the speed that the United States has gone from being a certain kind of regime to one in which the first family is using the office of the presidency to enrich itself on a scale which even in Trump 1.0 would have seemed beyond the bounds of reasonable expectation. How much of this is actually about, so Trump can strike deals, Erdogan could strike deals, these very wealthy people, business will default to corruption if politics allows it. So if the politics allows it, among other things, it allows the strongman to basically buy off and be bought off in a way that the institutions are meant to preserve us from.
Yeah, I mean, it is corruption. It also creates very severe conditions of inequality, I think. I mean, sometimes people say, oh, strongman or one-man regime, this is not correct because how could one person govern a whole country? It's a lot of people. And that is true in a way. But, in these types of regimes, what ends up happening is you have one person who's identified with the state, and then there's kind of like an umbrella or like a pyramid of their entourage or household or the hangers-on, the sycophants. And all of these people, of course, benefit from this regime and they do its bidding. But they can only be in these positions of power and access to wealth and protections of the law because the legal system also starts favoring. Are you close to the regime or are you like not close to the regime? It works differently if you're not. They know that they would not exist or be anybody except for their identification with the household of the strongman. Just as, like the Ottoman sultans, they had the janissaries who were they were taken from their houses as children. They didn't even know where they were from. They were kind of brought up. They were identified with the person of the sultan. So it's kind of the same kind of model in a strongman. Yeah, it's a corrupt system that favors those who have access, and everybody else is just like left out in the cold. And that, of course, increases also polarization because it becomes, of course, every society, or even democracies have polarized, party politics and so on. But this is really, you're either in or you're out. If you're out, you're not even a full citizen anymore. And so some people are like really clamoring to get in. It's corruption personified, literally. It's not about merit at all or any kind of rights, notion of rights. And we wanted to get away from that in modernity. And even before that, I mean, I think religion was a way to get away from it. Like this idea that no one person can be so powerful because the real power is not in this world. You're still accountable to somebody. Even if you're a king, you still have rules that you have to abide by. I think it was a way to kind of try to check this kind of unlimited power that a sovereign may try to grab. And in modernity, of course, we've found secular ways of trying to check that power, these ideas of like rights and equality and democracy and so on that we've discussed. But I suppose we got tired of them. The larger causes, they have their problems too. They maybe interfere in our lives too much or they tell us what to do. So maybe that's why like young people are like, we prefer strongman. We don't want to believe in anything big. We want one person to promise to solve all our problems. We don't want society to ask much of us. I don't know. I think it's just alternates, We solve one political problem, then the solution we find causes its own problems and fatigue, and then the old problem comes back as we get away from the solutions we've devised.
I want to ask you two more questions. So one is, I think there is often an expectation, I think this has certainly been true in the United States since Trump returned to power, that the ultimate guardrail, the institution, the impersonal institution, that in the end is our best safeguard against this kind of politics, particularly because this kind of politics is corrupt and corruption is inefficient. We all know corruption is inefficient, is what's called the markets, particularly the international markets, particularly the bond markets, actually, that there is a disciplining effect out there, which is countries like the United States can't ultimately, given the range of their fiscal and other responsibilities, buck the markets. And again, my instinct tells me that the experience of these other strongmen over time is that we shouldn't rely too much on the markets to get us out of this. Trump is, on a path to bankrupting the United States over time if he got his way. In the same way, actually, Nigel Farage would pretty much bankrupt Britain. His plans, it's not that just that they don't add up, they are inconceivable in terms of fiscal responsibility. But the markets, which are purely impersonal in some respects, the most impersonal form of authority, they don't seem to have the disciplining effect that people might hope. And even in the first few months of Trump's second time around, the thought was the tariff regime would seem so absurd to the markets that the markets would kind of beat sense into him. Well, actually, it turns out that in a world of strongmen politics, the markets have almost been cowed. I mean, I feel like that is maybe where the next level of complacency needs to be. We need to be disabused of it. The markets aren't going to save us any more than the Constitution is going to save us.
No, I mean, I've heard this argument many times before, too, in the Turkish context. And yeah, the markets are not coming to save us. The markets are not the cavalry. First of all, markets are not rational because the people, in the markets are not rational. And of course, financialization, with, late stage capitalism and so on. So it's not like the markets are like some kind of, as long as some kind of value is being created, whether through real things or like people's beliefs, the markets will respond to it. So a lot of the value in the markets are based on the promises of things rather than the actual delivery of things. I mean, what we're seeing with AI and so on. So that's one thing. The other thing is, I was having this discussion with an economic historian, and he was saying, the US, they're going to wake up. They're going to realize, as you said, like with Farage, that this is not going to work. He's not going to deliver. But I said to him, even in Turkey compared to the UK or the US, I mean, it's like a middle income country. It's not as rich. But just the resources of the Turkish state, Erdogan has been kind of distributing in ways that benefit him to his like cronies and his base. And it's taken him, decades to go through it all. And then he gets like foreign investment, all of that. There's so much stuff to distribute in the American setting and in the British setting, even after all the privatization and so on. There's like the resources, as far as these people are concerned, are endless, and they don't have to please everybody. I mean, all these expectations about equal distribution, citizens having certain expectations, they're from the 20th century. They just need to distribute resources in a way that benefit themselves and their supporters. And at some point, they don't even need like the supporters anymore. Once you entrench yourself, you just have to distribute resources in a way that you prevent protests or revolutions. Like they can always buy time. I mean, same thing with Russia. So this idea of the markets correcting or somehow terrible economic policy according to 20th century standards being kind of death knell of this type of regime, none of that is true. I mean, I think it's been proven many times over that it's just not any kind of guarantee. And also, like, a lot of the capitalists, like, they might actually even prefer this kind of, like, it's easier. You said corruption is inefficient, but it's not inefficient if you are somebody who just wants to call Trump and say, like, pass this law that benefits me. Like, maybe in that case, it's efficient for you. It's unpredictable, maybe, if we fall out of favor, but in the short term, it's more efficient than dealing with a bunch of MPs and you don't know how they're going to vote.
Okay, so the last question is, where do you think this is going in 5 years and in 50 years? Those are the two time frames. We could pick any time frame. I'll just say my feeling about this and then ask you what you think. But the thing that you have described, the system, you called it the 20th century system in international politics. But I also think it's the 20th century system in domestic politics. The thing that we call democracy is a 20th century phenomenon. It was invented in the 20th century. It doesn't predate that, I don't think. And it has all sorts of features to it. Elections are central to it. That's the central device. Political parties are the central institution. It presupposes certain forms of campaigning and communication. It presupposes certain ways in which money works in the system and can be contained or constrained within the system. And it did work very well for a few decades. But it seems like that, if that's what we call democracy, democracy is super vulnerable now to being captured by strongmen because of technology, because of the changing nature of the populations of these societies, these aging populations, the changing nature of work and the economic basis on which these societies operate, the uncertainties, some of the sort of psychic angst of the 21st century, all of this, it seems like 20th century democracy is really ill-equipped to resist these trends. So I've argued a lot, and the series that this episode is a part of is part of this argument, which is it's insane to think that that's the only thing democracy can be. Democracy can be a million different things. That's just the version it took in and it peaked in, I don't know, 1980-something or 90-something or whatever. But democracy is the way in which people can be involved in politics, randomize politics, create certain kinds of new ideas and experiments in politics. Democracy should be unpredictable, surprising, but it requires people being given all sorts of opportunities to mess with the system. And what we now have is strong men are messing with the system can't cope with them, but people are still being funneled into that system to express their political beliefs, which just seems to me to hand power to the strong men. So what we should do is break up democracy and make it 10 different things. We should experiment with it. We should try new stuff. We should involve people in different ways, ask them different kinds of questions, take risks with it. If we don't take risks with democracy, we're just signing its death warrant. So we should take a chance. Don't know what will happen. What would happen if you randomized it, if you let ordinary people take big decisions, if you genuinely gave power to citizens' assemblies, if you completely rewrote the voting system. But my fear is that none of that's going to happen. That actually we're on this path and what we're going to do is keep digging the hole, which is 20th century democracy. And all that's going to happen is that the strong men watch us dig the hole and they just walk off into the distance. So that's why I'm pessimistic. But I would say the grounds for optimism is the thing that you described, which is it's on us. So if you think democracy doesn't mean voting in elections and choosing which political party you want to be governed by, but you think democracy is having an opportunity every now and then to really mess with the system, then, if we're willing to take on that fight, yeah, we can take these people down. But it just does require, I think, an understanding of democracy which is much more open to risk, much less defensive, much less nostalgic, and understands that the key feature in democratic politics is basically allowing random things to happen. And at the moment, it's not random. The thing you've described is the opposite of random. It is an inexorable trend. We just need to disrupt it. That's my take.
I agree. I mean, I think part of the obstacle we're facing is something has ended, but many of us has not come to terms with it. We're still kind of grieving 20th century, both international politics and domestic politics, especially in the West, and we're trying to kind of recover it or go back to it. But I agree with you that there's no going back to it. We need to disrupt. We have to come up with new solutions and maybe not get so hung up on the shape of things. I mean, even the word democracy, like it's possible to conceive of a 21st century where the word democracy survives. But what it entails is actually something very far from democracy. I mean, maybe there are still elections or something, or like in Europe, there's like an attachment to the word because it means something. But in practice, it's not like an ideal system. I think we need to worry more about is power, centralized? Are there checks on the private use of, state institutions? Is it a relatively pluralistic society? And I think there have been arrangements in history that were not democratic, but came close to approximating some of those conditions, even outside of the West. So I think what we need to find is like our way back to these types of arrangements. Like, how do we ensure that? And I think one of the most important things is recovering this idea of like, why does an ordinary person matter? As far as I see it, what's really problematic in strongman politics, whether we're talking about in antiquity or, early modern era or now, is this idea that the ruler is somehow intrinsically distinct and superior than everybody else. And therefore it's not just they're richer and politically more powerful, but they have like some kind of inalienable right to be above everybody else. And what worries me is all these, just as, power is centralizing, there are all these also experiments with chasing immortality. I don't know if you saw Putin was captured on a hot mic talking to Xi and saying, like talking about organ transplants and how it may be possible to become immortal one day. So they're already thinking about it. We know the tech bros are thinking about it. So it's not just strongman politics, but like a very all type, because, like the ones in antiquity also thought they were so powerful that they were going to be immortal. And early modern era, they thought they had divine, sanction and all of that.
It's like hot micing a convention of pharaohs. That's what it reminded me of.
Yes, exactly. So how do we recover this in the face of that? Because I think this is what happens when you have so much wealth, so much power. It's like almost natural. You think, I am clearly a god. Like all the evidence points to me being a god and not being the same as these other people who are like cattle or they're like some other species. They're not me. And what reminds people that they are human is that they die. And then we are reminded of that. But we need like a bigger argument as to why the regular people matter, whether we find it in religion or politics or something. We need to recover that. It's not just the shape of democracy, but some principle as to why ordinary people matter. And that's, I think, what we need in the 21st century. Refine that argument.
And I would say thinking that ordinary people matter is the definition of democracy. And like you say, the shape doesn't matter. And there are many forms of more recent democracy in which most ordinary people think that they don't matter. But the core idea is precisely that ordinary people do matter. And the only way you can make that real and visible is to give them the power to disrupt this system. The system itself has become frozen. It's ossified. It's being captured because it's so rigid and frightened and scared of its own shadow. And the politicians who emerge from it, Keir Starmer is a good example, they're just frightened of themselves almost. So get rid of that lot and let ordinary people take a chance on the system. I mean, risk things in the system by giving ordinary people more of a foothold in it. It seems to me that's the only way, or let the strongmen rule. It's almost like Keir Starmer is just caught in the crossfire. If you don't want Nigel Farage to be Prime Minister, you're not going to do it by just the Labour Party pretending it's 1997 all over again. You're only going to do it by letting ordinary people, most of whom can see through Nigel Farage, have a real say. As I said, that is the end of Fixing Democracy. I don't know whether we fixed it or not. But next time, we are going to try and answer some of the many questions that you have sent in. Questions, comments, ideas, suggestions, your fixes for what's wrong with democracy. That is a conversation with me and David Klemperer, who was our guide to proportional representation at the start of this series, and to compulsory voting. And we're going to be talking about ideas big and small, practical suggestions that you've offered, but also big questions and big pushback against some of the themes in this series. And in the meantime, a reminder, if you haven't seen, that the next film in our autumn film season at the Regent Street Cinema in London is coming up in a fortnight on Bonfire Night in Britain. Might not mean that much to people in other parts of the world. The 5th of November. We are going to be screening Derek Jarman's extraordinary film about Ludwig Wittgenstein. And then I'm going to be talking to the philosopher, historian and writer Nikhil Krishnan about the film and about the life of Wittgenstein. If you'd like a different kind of fireworks, come and join us on the 5th of November at the Regent Street Cinema. To get your tickets, click on the link in the show description. Go to our website, ppfideas.com. Next time, David Klemperer and I will try and answer your questions about democracy. This has been Past, Present, Future.